Thousands of voices are telling you how to do modern dating and relationships. Scroll through your feed and anyone with charisma and a microphone can become a relationship expert. And maybe you've grown disillusioned with those voices. You've tried to follow the advice but still struggled in your own relationship or wondered what, if anything, you can actually trust. And the opportunity to speak into this moment is massive because the reality is sobering. Divorce rates hover above 50%, and if you factor in the number of couples who are actually happy, the percentages fall much lower. But here's the good news. Finding a successful, happy, long-lasting relationship is not impossible, but only if you understand the truth and apply it to your life. That's why we sat down with Dr. Tashiro, one of the top relationship scientists in the world. He synthesized decades of research across psychology and relationship science, and he's gotten to the root of what really makes love last. If you're new to Mighty Pursuit, we exist to help you make sense of the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, not as vague wellness cliches, but as deeply interconnected parts of your everyday experience. We believe putting the whole person back together is the key to living well. And in today's episode, we zoom into our wisdom category, looking how wisdom shapes our relationships. Because love isn't just about chemistry or chance, it's about the choices we make and the patterns we bring with us. In this conversation, you'll hear why the very things most of us chase in a partner, passion, beauty, money, can backfire. We'll explore the consequences of listening to the wrong voices on this subject, and most importantly, you'll learn the traits the science says actually predict a happy, lasting relationship. And by the end, you may never look at your own choices in love the same way again. Ty, after studying your work, it became clear to me that a large amount of people get exactly what they wish for in a partner, only to find out that it backfires and it doesn't actually lead to long-term success. So can you share one of those stories with us and why what we want in a partner is so often at odds with what we actually need?
Well, first of all, I'll say it's totally understandable because it happens to all of us at some point, right? Where we think we know what we want, we actually get it, and then it turns out to be something totally different once the relationship gets going.
Yeah.
I'll give you a story about this. Sometimes when you go to the waiting room to pick up people for a therapy session, you know, right off the bat, it's going to be an interesting one. And that was the case with this one session I had. It was with a couple. I loved both of them. They were both great people, had great hearts. And when I walked out to the waiting room, the guy had a huge bandage right over the middle of his forehead. He'd clearly been to the emergency room. So I knew this was going to be something interesting that had happened since the previous week. So we got into the session, and I just casually said, "So what's going on with the bandage?" And he said, "Well, she, you know how this goes, they're still mad at each other." So he points at her. He says, "Well, she threw a beer bottle at my forehead and hit me right between the eyes." And she had been a former college softball player, so she had quite an arm on her. And so I got the story. And it all started with a nasty pair of socks. So maybe some of the women out there can relate to this. But socks, yeah. The guy walks in every day, takes his shoes off, and just starts disrobing on his way to the rest of the house. And so he always took off his dirty socks and just laid them there on the ground. And of course, she hated that. And that's understandable. So I said, "Buddy, you gotta pick up your nasty socks." But she was just extra angry about today. And it tipped into that kind of rage where she felt the hairs on the back of her neck raise. And they got to screaming at each other. And he just kind of started blowing her off, which of course makes it worse. So to get his attention, she picked up a half-empty beer bottle, which he of course had left just laying around, took it by the neck and hucked it across the room, hit him right between the eyes. And so he's bleeding all over the place. And there was police and emergency room, all the things. Obviously, it was not a great situation. And sometimes when couples step back from it, they just think, how did we get here? How did we go from being so in love with each other and want to spend the rest of our lives together and Now my husband's in the ER because I hit him in the forehead with a bottle, and it was over a pair of dirty socks. Now, no one's more or less guilty in this situation, I'll say, in the big picture. But if you go back and you look at the history of what they were looking for and what excited them at the start, it kind of makes perfect sense. So when they were first falling in love with each other, she thought he was so laid back and didn't get bent out of shape about much of anything. And she really appreciated his kind of casual approach towards life. For him, he said she was spicy, it was his word. And he really liked just how passionate she was and just how fiery she pursued, how much fire she had for pursuing everything in life. Really. Yeah. And so it seemed like a match made in heaven, because here you had someone who was really passionate and excited, and you had someone who was really laid back and casual. But once they got into the relationship, it morphed into something different. And all of a sudden, this guy who was laid back and casual is now lazy and irresponsible. All of a sudden, this person who was seen as really passionate and spicy now has anger problems and temper problems. And that can happen to a lot of couples. And I think if we look back and you trace the history of it, it can give couples a lot of insight as to how they got to where they are. And sometimes what it can do is it can help them remember why they fell in love with each other in the first place.
Yeah.
And what the best end of those characteristics, what the best manifestation of those characteristics are. And, but when you're dating, that's the best time to have this awareness about, hey, what are the things that I actually want? And does that align with the kind of life that I want for my romantic, lifelong romantic partnership? And if you reverse engineer it that way, when you say, hey, these are the things I want for my romantic life long term, a lot of times you make much better decisions than if you just try to cobble it together with the passions and the things that first strike you when you're meeting somebody.
Such a extreme outcome of how you could enter into a relationship with somebody and love all these things about them, and then those very things that you loved in the beginning ended up being the things that annoy you so deeply. And I can't help but think like there's a lot of confusion for people on the front end of dating, of things that they're drawn to, and that ends up backfiring them. And how often do you see that? Like, how often do you see the thing that we're drawn to is the thing that we end up hating in the end?
Almost every couple. I mean, even couples that are really happy. No relationship is perfect, of course. And even when you talk to couples who've been married 40, 50 years and have been largely happy during the course of their marriage, there's, of course, things that drive them nuts about their partner, things that annoy them or that they see as hassles. And when you talk to them about it and you dig into it, a lot of times they'll say, yeah, I thought it was cute at first, and now for 40, 50 years, it's been an annoyance to me. But that's okay. That's just part of, nobody's perfect. No relationship is perfect. And the kind of key is if there are going to be annoyances, if there are going to be disagreements or hassles, are these things that are acceptable in the bigger picture? Are these things that I can live with if I want to spend the rest of my life with this person and share my finances with this person, raise my kids with this person? Is this the type of person as a whole, both the good things and the negative things, that I can do that with?
Yeah, and I think people hear that story, obviously they want that to avoid being their fate. And I mean, we'll get into some of the statistics, but a lot of people have been familiar with the 50% divorce rate numbers for a long time. I mean, but then when you add how many other people are unhappy in just a union, and so there's just like a large percentage of population that are ending up in an unhappy scenario, on top of the fact that they're struggling with dating. And if I learned one thing from your book, it's that a lot of the mindsets around this conversation have changed wildly over the past, not only 50 years, but last 150 years. And so how do you think our modern mindsets about love and marriage differ from previous generations?
Yeah. There's been some great anthropological work actually about romantic relationships. And a lot of times the titles of these books or these journal articles will have the word myth in it, because we do have all these stereotypes about what romantic life should be or what we think it is. And the reality is actually often far from these ideals that we have. So to go back to the satisfaction and stability of romantic relationships, the divorce rate for first marriages is about 41%. The good news is that's gone down 2 or 3 percentage points over the past few years. But then if you take into account the number of people who are unhappy, that's about another 8 to 10% of folks. So that gets us up to 41% first marriage divorce rate. 8 to 10% are chronically unhappy. So more years are bad than good. And then these clever sociologists at Harvard, they said, well, but a lot of people divorce for all intents and purposes, but they never file their paperwork. So they'll never see each other again. They can't stand each other. They're divorced, basically, but they don't file, so it doesn't count. That's another 10 to 15% of couples. Wow. So if you add all that up, that means about 60% of marriages are either unhappy or unstable. And that differs widely from the goal that people have, which is essentially to live happily ever after. So you want it till death do us part, and you want it to be happy more often than not. And in the United States, we want it to be happy all the time, which is another grave misunderstanding of what real relationships look like. So you can take some of the marital outcome data, and right off the bat, you can see, all right, we're not doing as great as we think we are. What I've been really interested in lately is how hard it is to date right now, especially if you're a young adult. So let's say 18 to 25 years old, 18 to 30 years old. There's some new data about this that is really interesting. So the average person wants to marry by age 26, which that kind of fits, right, with probably what you would guess.
For Gen Z?
For Gen Z, for millennials, they say 26 is about the age I want to get married. Now, if you look at the reality, though, a lot of people aren't marrying by age 26. So for boomers, if you looked at the percentage of people who were not married by the age of 40, it was about 6%. For Gen X, it went up to about 15% of people were not married by age 40. And now it's 25% of people are not married by the age of 40.
Wow.
So that differs widely, right, from this, I'm going to be married by 26. The average age of marriage for boomers was about 21 years old. It's about 29 years old now. So there's been these dramatic shifts just across the course of, let's say, 2 generations. And we're kind of operating off some of the old stereotypes, right? So if your folks were boomers or Gen X, you're kind of thinking the timeline, for example, should be shifted up. You're going to get married earlier in the process. But in fact, what's happening is a lot of people are staying single, and a lot of people are marrying later than they would want to. One other thing that I find really interesting right now is what people want. So the outcomes are people are marrying later or not getting married. But then if you ask 18 to 25-year-olds, what are you looking for in your romantic relationships? Pew conducted a really interesting study about this. It was over 4,000 young adults. And they said, what do you want from your romantic relationship? About 10% of young adults said, I want a committed relationship. About 16% said, yeah, I'll take something casual. And about another 24% said, I'll do either one, casual or committed. Now, that's kind of interesting that the committed relationship seekers is so low. But what I find even more interesting is that 50% said they're not interested in dating at all. And when I talk about this in talks for the audience is mostly boomers, they almost fall out of their chairs.
That makes no sense.
Yeah, because they were married by age 21. So this idea that 18 to 25-year-olds, half of them aren't even looking to date, really is shocking to older generations. And sometimes if you're in that cohort, if you're in that young adult cohort, you can feel like something's wrong with you, that you should be dating more, you should be in a relationship. But in fact, a lot of your peers are not in relationships. And in fact, half of your peers aren't even looking for a relationship. And that's not to rip on young adults or Gen Z at all. I think they've been dealt a really tough set of circumstances. And they're just overwhelmed and anxious about dating. And I think it's pretty understandable.
So what are the reasons why they do not want to date? And is that like a permit? Like, do you see that as like, oh, I just permanently don't want to be in a relationship? Or is it like a temporary type of mentality?
Well, for now, it's temporary, but you don't know how long it's gonna persist for, right? I found it interesting during the election. I won't get very political here, but I found it interesting during the election that there was a lot of fish shaking going on, where sometimes people would talk about this low marriage rate or low rate of fertility that we're seeing now. And sometimes you'd have people shaking their fists and say, that's the feminists' fault. And you might have the other side saying, it's the manosphere podcast, people's fault. I just don't think that's really the best explanation. One of the better explanations, there's a few, but one of the better explanations is that Gen Z, more so than any other generation, wants to have their individual life together before they get into a lifelong partnership. So they want to have their career sorted out. They want to have their financial life in a stable kind of place before they settle down with someone for the rest of their life. And that's actually probably pretty wise, probably a pretty good idea. But they're in an environment where there's tremendous job instability, tremendous economic instability. And so the combination of those two things isn't great then for partnering up with somebody. I think another factor is the online dating apps are frustrating for a lot of folks. And it just kind of seems like a hamster wheel to a lot of young adults. Like they just keep swiping and nothing productive comes of it. So I think between those, two things, there's a variety of other factors, but between those two things, it's tough out there for young adults to date and to have faith that they're going to have a life circumstance that's going to allow them to have a chance to have a happy and stable relationship.
Yeah, I mean, because you have two different things. You have, on one hand, desire. I desire for this to happen. I desire to be in a relationship or to be married. And then there's a second thing, which is belief. Like I have a belief that this is actually possible for me and that it's going to go well. And I think it's interesting when you're talking about basically these large systemic changes that have happened in our society. I think the trend, probably with boomers and Gen X, was that marriage was something that was seen as kind of the pinnacle or one of the pinnacles of a good life. And then with millennials, I think you saw this boom in, I'm going to focus on my career. That kind of trend started, and my success, my ambition is like what's paramount about me, that defines my worth. And so here we are in 2025. Like, what is your sense of what this generation like actually wants? Like when people actually still say they want love, are they after happily ever after still, or has the goal shifted into something else entirely?
Yeah, so this surprises me. So after everything we just talked about, with not wanting to date and some of these other impediments that young adults are facing with dating, if you look at surveys, still most people want to get married or want to have a lifelong partnership. So about 92% of people would like to get married or have a lifelong partnership.
Eventually,
yeah. Eventually. Only 8% don't want to. And that's been stable, actually, across the past 20 or 30 years. It kind of gives me hope a bit that, hey, despite all of these challenges that people are having, they still are holding out and believing in this long-term vision of finding somebody that they can love for the rest of their life.
Well, if there's one thing about younger people today, it's coincided with this boom in social media, podcast, information. Anybody with a microphone today can become a relationship expert if they're charismatic. You start dropping hot takes on social media, all of a sudden you're at like 1 million followers, and now you're a relationship expert. So much information about how to achieve those goals, get out of these ruts, find a partner. As someone who has actually synthesized decades of scientific data. I'm curious, like, what's your current take on the dating landscape, self-help landscape, information, and what do you think it's doing to people's chances of like real, long-lasting love?
Let's see. It gives me a bit of indigestion, the current advice landscape, I guess. I don't want to be like the get off my lawn guy. I realize a lot of information now is delivered in shorter bursts. Yeah. And that's just kind of the information landscape right now. I think what's hard is, in this attention economy, a lot of things get sensationalized, of course, and a lot of things get dramatized. And it's kind of the opposite of what you need when you're getting advice about your romantic life. In my opinion, what you need for advice in your romantic life is something that's very steady and very measured, because romance is so up and down by its nature, right? You just need someone to say, hey, it's okay, number one. Number two, let's stop here and let's actually think deeply and let's think critically about what's going on. So if I see a TikTok or a Instagram and it's like, hey, here's 3 things to find lasting love, I can't imagine how that would end up being good advice or some advice that would actually propel somebody forward. If people are taking in their information that way, that's okay. But what I usually encourage folks to do is, if you hear something on social media that sounds like good relationship advice, now get in the rabbit hole. Now let's try to backtrack where that information come from. And if that person can't provide it for you, now let's go somewhere else to look for advice where you can actually get a broad perspective about how relationships function and what you would need to do to think critically, long and hard over the course of months or years to refine your understanding of what you need and what you want, and then also how to get it.
What do you think the danger is in listening to like the loudest and most charismatic voices in the room, especially if what they're saying isn't backed by any sort of data or anything else?
I think the hardest thing about taking in information from the loudest voices in the room is there's an opportunity cost to it. So by following that advice that might be misguided, you're by definition now not doing something else that would be more productive. And so I think that's the greatest danger, probably, with some of this sensationalized social media advice that's out there. Once again, I don't want to say that there's not good advice out there, or that people can't benefit from 30-second or 2-minute snippets of advice. But you always want to keep in mind, like, if I think this is solving my problem, that means I'm not doing something else that could be more productive. And so I always just encourage folks to stop and think, hey, this is one way to look at it. What would be some alternative perspectives? And then be proactive about figuring it out. I mean, for people who use social media a lot, they're really good at finding information.
Yeah.
I mean, they could track down anybody in the world through Google or whatever else. So I always say use that ability to navigate the internet and to search for things, to find 2 or 3 perspectives on somebody giving an opinion about something for really what's one of the most important things in your life, which is your romantic relationships. I mean, I would say if someone were to see a clip of you and me talking, and I give an opinion about something, they should go look for somebody else's opinion. And they might end up thinking what I said is not for them. I'm thrilled that would happen. I would much rather have that happen than folks just take the first thing that they hear.
In terms of like hot takes, and are there certain myths or common trends in giving relationship advice online that are being spread that the science doesn't support, that you're concerned about, or things that you see popping up over and over again?
Yeah. I mean, a recent trend that really bothered me on social media, I guess if you just think about this stuff all day long, if you're in any field and you think about something a lot, you'll see things on social media or by folks who haven't thought a tremendous amount about it. And it'll make you kind of anxious and frustrated. Something that happened last summer was the finding a guy in finance. And that by itself is okay. I don't have anything against guys in finance. But it was kind of this broader trend of like, hey, look for somebody who's wealthier, who has money. One of the trends this summer was "No Broke Boys," the song, which is a great song, but kind of along the same lines. And when I hear that, I think, yeah, you want to be in a financially stable kind of situation. That's good for a couple, because now you're not stressed out by, trying to make rent or pay your bills, and that of course gives you a stable base to have a relationship. But it's really one of these diminishing return phenomenons. So I always tell people there's no difference between dating somebody who makes $80,000 a year and somebody who makes $800,000 a year. There's really no gain in your marital happiness or your marital stability, even by making that huge financial jump. Now, you'll have really nice things, and you'll get to do some cool, expensive experiences. But when it comes to will you have a happily ever after, there's really no difference. So there's an example of if someone now is looking for a partner who's wealthy, that means by definition, they're not looking for something else that actually might be more productive and contribute to the relationship happiness.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different kind of mentalities that are predominant in our society that have driven the dating landscape for many years. And even reading your book, I think it's interesting because some of them do play into the tropes and the stereotypes. I mean, money is one of them. And you said that on dating apps, like the two things that are looked at the most are pictures and then like job titles. And so how does that differ for like men and women?
Yeah. So there's been some really fascinating studies now with online dating. It's nice with online dating because you can see what people actually do rather than what they say they do. And sometimes there's a divide between those two things. Mm-hmm. And so if you just ask people like in a self-report survey, hey, what do you want in a partner? They'll say the things that are socially desirable. So they'll say, oh, I want a man of fine character, or I want somebody who's very kind and generous. And these things you're supposed to say. But if you watch actual behavior in online dating apps, you get a different kind of picture. One of my favorite studies was a study on Hinge. It was hundreds of thousands of users. And one of the questions they wanted to investigate was how long do people spend on a profile before they swipe left or swipe right, right? So say, I don't want to date this person, or I do want to date this person, maybe. It was about 2 seconds that people spend.
2 seconds?
About 2 seconds. And if you talk to people who use dating apps a lot, they'll say, yeah, that's about right. And if you think about what can happen in a user interface in 2 seconds, what can you look at? Well, you could look at the picture, and maybe you could look at their age or look at their job title. And that's all you're going to be able to take in. And also on a user interface, of course, the picture is the most dominant feature or element on the screen. Now, I don't blame online dating companies because they're kind of giving people what they want, right? However, what that means is, this is one of these things that I try not to say anything, but when I see people swiping really quickly, like on the subway, I privately think to myself, there goes somebody who you know nothing about. Because when you swipe left, it's not like a preference. That's actually a hard rule out. You're not going to have a chance to match with this person. So let's say you wanted somebody who's at least, 6 foot tall, for example, and you swipe left because they're not 6 feet tall. What I think in my mind is they want somebody who's 5'10", who might be really kind, really generous, and really loving. And you have no idea whether that's the case or not, because you ruled them out on height. So, with the online dating, I think it can be a really great tool for people, and it can actually be a really great way to meet people and sometimes have a substantial relationship. Mm. But, like any interface, I guess, with technology, you want to think about, so what's this technology catered toward, right? And how is it trying to please people? And then you want to stop and ask yourself, is my goal of being in this online dating environment to have a pleasing user experience? I would argue maybe that shouldn't be the goal. The goal here is to generate a pool of people who you could be really happy with, who you could have a substantive, meaningful relationship with. Now, if that's the goal, then you start to use the app in a very different kind of way. There's still limited information, but, heaven forbid you could read some of the stuff they wrote. You could take a closer look at what's going on rather than just deciding based on their photo.
Yeah, the height phenomenon is interesting. I had a friend who is a content creator. He's pretty big on Instagram and YouTube. But anyway, he started going around doing like men on the street interviews with women asking about height. And like that has become much more in the public discourse, it feels like, over the last few years, about how much height is prioritized. And it is kind of weird because if you swipe right on someone because of their height, I can't really think of an equivalent versus like if dating apps started putting women's breast size like on as a measurement on there, and you started like swiping on that. It's just like, it seems like such a strange like characteristic that you would put on a dating app.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much of what we do in our romantic relationships is actually kind of funny and bizarre when you take a step back. And I think your analogy is totally right there. And but people understand this. So one of the things that men lie about the most on their online dating profile is their height. So men are about 1.5 inches or 2 inches taller on their online dating profile than they actually are in real life. To take the female example, there are so many blondes on online dating sites. There's no way that could be possible if you look at the actual population prevalence of blonde people. So, if you're the one being selected, you do have the self-awareness that, yeah, I am being evaluated on these kind of arbitrary things. And then people subconsciously start to fudge things a little bit to sort of peacock and attract a mate.
Yeah, and if someone's listening and being like, "Oh, you're just talking about this because you're a man," like, like that's really not that. I mean, I'm actually 6'1", so like it's not. I think that just for the general population, it's like I'm not complaining about it personally. I think I'm complaining about it and making observation of what this perhaps might be doing. These sorts of like quick judgments on people just from their pictures and everything else. And so, I mean, the two big ones that we were circling on with the dating app. So that kind of ties into appearance, beauty, aesthetics, and then we mentioned the status and the job title and the money. So if you were to highlight into those two things, because it was such a big part of your book, how do those preferences differ for men and women and what they want in a relationship based on studies and everything else?
Sure, yeah. So when it comes to prioritizing looks and money in choosing a partner, there's been a really rich research tradition in evolutionary psychology about how there's these pretty consistent differences between men and women and how they prioritize looks and money. And the way those findings, almost always come out is that men will prioritize looks as their kind of top priority, and women will prioritize socioeconomic status or income as their top priority. And this just kind of replicates across studies. And now with these online dating studies, you can see it play out as well. There's a real premium on these two characteristics, looks and money. And if you look at both men and women, and you were to say, so what's in the top 3 of the things that they wish for? Looks and money are there for both men and women.
Like almost always?
Almost always. If you look at actual behavior. Now, once again, if you ask people just self-report, hey, what do you want? They'll give you I want someone of fine character and whatever. But if you look at their actual behavior, so in speed dating studies or in online dating studies, or other studies where they force people to actually have the rubber meet the road and show their cards, show what they're actually going to select on, then you'll find that women are going to select on income and men will select on looks.
Like as the number one.
As the number one, above all else. Now, look, maybe that's okay. So I don't want to be judgmental here because maybe we could say look, maybe you choose a partner who's really hot, and that actually makes you really happy and makes you want to stay with that person. So maybe I have a really hot wife, and I wake up every morning and I look over and I just think, I am so happy that you are so smoking hot. That makes me so satisfied in our marriage. And you think, I would never leave this marriage because you are so smoking hot. Now, that sounds a little shallow, but maybe that's true.
Is that what happens?
Well, and same way the other way. Maybe the woman wakes up and she's like, you are so stinking rich. Like, it makes me so happy in our marriage and want to stay with you. Now, if you look at longitudinal studies and you look at, does physical attractiveness predict long-term happiness and does it predict long-term stability? The answer is no. So your return on investment, if you want to think about it that way, because you're treating physical appearance as kind of an investment, you're saying this is a good characteristic that I think will grow our relationship, right? Or continue to yield on marital happiness or marital stability. The return on investment for physical attractiveness is zero. And in some studies, if a woman has a physically attractive male partner, it's actually predictive of less stability because they're attractive to you, but they're attractive to other people as well. So there's just not a lot of gain to be had by physical attractiveness. And, I tell folks, kissing your partner shouldn't feel like eating your veggies. So there needs to be a level of physical attractiveness there in place.
Attraction, yeah.
Attraction, right?
Yeah.
But what people do is they overly maximize on it. So they want to get the hottest person possible, and they'll sacrifice other characteristics to maximize on physical attractiveness. The same thing will happen then for income or socioeconomic status, where people will really try to maximize on that. But once again, if you look at longitudinal studies and you say, all right, so you have a couple that's very wealthy, you have a couple that's, let's say, middle income, and then you have a couple that's right below the poverty line. How does that shake out? Are there any differences in happiness or in the risk for divorce? The answer is actually pretty nuanced, and I find this interesting. So money does matter up to right past the poverty line. So if you're under financial strain, that has a negative effect on your marital stability and also on your marital happiness. And that kind of makes sense, right?
Yeah.
You just stress a lot about things in life. There's more things to fight about, and it just makes it hard. But once you cross, a bit past the poverty line, all of a sudden you start to see that diminishing return, where if you make, $50,000, $60,000 a year, you're fine. And if you make $500,000 a year, there's not much difference, once again, between the people making $500,000 and the people making $50,000 or $60,000. So should you maximize on income as a way to select a partner? The data would argue against it. So what the data does argue for is get somebody who you'll probably collectively have a financially stable life with.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, logically, it makes a lot of sense to me on two fronts. So, like, nobody would want to just be struggling, and financially, so many fights would probably arise from that. Anybody who's went through that would immediately identify that is not a situation that I want to be in. And then also logically, with the beauty stuff, it's like thinking about beauty as some sort of appreciating asset or something that would stay consistent is kind of weird, because how somebody would look at 30 is not how they're going to look at 50 probably, or 60, unless there's this enormous pressure to maintain appearance and surgeries and all this other stuff. But I think it's important to get into the nuance of it, to examine the helpfulness or the kind of unhelpfulness of these two values that we have in relationships. So for beauty, would it actually make somebody happy if they are more sexually satisfied because of somebody's appearance?
Yeah. So I was really interested in this question a few years ago. It surprised me I hadn't looked it up before this. And there's kind of two answers to this. So if you ask people self-report, how attractive do you think your partner is? And then you ask them, hey, how sexually satisfied are you? You get a pretty good correlation between those two measures, which would make sense, right? I think my partner is attractive and I'm sexually satisfied. Now, there's a second way you can do that study, which I find more interesting, which is let's have people who don't know either partner, right, who are blind coders, rate pictures of each partner. And like, how hot are you on a scale of 0 to 10? Average those scores so each partner gets this hotness score, basically. Now let's correlate that objective, right, measure of physical attractiveness with each partner's rating of sexual satisfaction.
Yeah.
I think that's a more interesting study. And what you find in those studies is there's no to maybe a small correlation between objective attractiveness and sexual satisfaction. And there's been some hand-wringing among researchers about why that might be the case. You would think, hey, if you're with someone really hot, shouldn't you be more sexually satisfied? And one of the kind of amusing explanations I've heard is that if you're hotter, maybe you don't have to try as hard, or you feel you don't have to try as hard. And so then that brings down the level of sexual satisfaction, kind of washes out the hotness advantage. So, you know, even for something where you think it would be really valuable, like sexual satisfaction, it kind of isn't. And really comes down to, do you, with your subjective perception, find this person attractive? And there's all kinds of roads to finding somebody attractive. You know, folks have the experience where maybe they're just walking down the street and they see somebody who's just stunningly attractive, and you might even have your head on a swivel and look, they're just that good looking.
Yeah.
And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with folks like that. You know, and I should make clear, there's nothing wrong with physically attractive people. You know, there's nothing wrong with people who have high income. It's just that it's not this added bonus that people think it is. But another route to finding somebody attractive, which is a little more fun, I think, is you think, oh yeah, they're kind of cute. Or maybe you don't even have an opinion at first. But then you get to talking to them. Then you get to spending some time with them. And on the second date, they're more attractive to you than they were on the first date. You know, third date more than the second, and so on and so forth. Then maybe the two of you are dating and something hard happens or something difficult happens. And they're supportive in a way you could not have imagined. Oh my goodness. Now that's super attractive, right? And those are my favorite love stories, where the couple met. There wasn't necessarily sparks at the very beginning, but they grew to have this unbelievable attraction toward each other over time, and it grew because of who they were, not just how they appeared.
Yeah, I mean, that's so, on one level, that's so surprising to me, because there's all these social things that are mixed into it, like how other people are perceiving us, what we think we should want, which is why I think it's a more honest study if you set up the parameters differently, because people aren't always going to be honest or even perceiving what their actual behaviors are if you're asking them in a study to just rate these things. But on another level, it makes sense to me that if you're having sex with somebody, there's a lot more that goes into it than, I guess, just you being attracted to them. Like, what is your dynamic? What's actually happening in that sexual encounter? And you might have something that's full of a lot more passion with somebody else, rather than what you just said, like someone who is objectively like so incredibly beautiful might not be this best sexual partner.
They might not be, you know, and there are a lot of other factors. So, I mean, sometimes somebody just might be good at sex, you know, and they're kind of good with whoever. And so and who knows how that skill came about, but they're just more sexually skilled than the average person. You know, that would be a more satisfying kind of experience. One of my kind of favorite factors that's related to sexual satisfaction is this personality trait of agreeableness. And so agreeableness is kind of how oriented you are towards maintaining social harmony, and how focused you are about being empathic, understanding the other person's perspective, so that the two of you can get along and you can contribute towards one another. Agreeableness does correlate with sexual satisfaction pretty reliably. And agreeableness correlates with sexual satisfaction probably because you're interested in the other person's pleasure, rather than, especially for men, being focused on your own pleasure and not taking into account what's going on with the other person. So, if you were to say, hey, is hotness a better predictor of sexual satisfaction, objective hotness, or is agreeableness, all things equal, a better predictor? You'd take agreeableness because, here's another myth, right? In romantic relationships is that just because you're with somebody, the sexual chemistry should be good. And it almost never is. I mean, sometimes couples luck out and it is pretty good off the bat. But for a lot of couples, what happens is there's some clumsiness at the start.
Yeah.
And there's some kind of weirdness even sometimes. And so how do you get over that? You get over it by being a curious person. You get over it by talking to each other, by being comfortable with sharing with one another, and most of all, by being interested in the other person's satisfaction and pleasure. And so who's the best person to engage in that kind of behavior? It would be someone who's high in agreeableness. They're like perfectly suited to the sexual satisfaction improvement task.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes we're making this trade-offs between a positive trait that would fuel the relationship for something that we think we should want or that we've internalized. So what do you feel like the hidden cost of making beauty the priority is? If someone ends up leading with like looks, what do they usually end up sacrificing?
Yeah. Let me give you the thought experiment that I would do in my interpersonal relationships class that I taught for undergraduates. So I would do this every semester. And what I'd do in this thought experiment is I'd say, take out a piece of paper. I guess this is when students still had paper. And I'd say, write down all the things you want in a romantic partner. What would be your dream list of characteristics? I'd give them about 5 minutes. They'd inevitably want more time. And good for them. But they would write about 20 or 30 characteristics that they'd want in a romantic partner. Great. Then I would ask if anybody was willing to volunteer their list for the class. And, good on them. People would always volunteer their lists. About 200 students, say about 100 men, 100 women. And so I'd have all the men put their hand up in the air. So you have 100 men with their hands raised. And I would say, if this characteristic I read does not apply to you, then put your hand down. And so you have 100 women watching this thought experiment take place. And let's say the first thing is, I want a partner who's tall. So I'd ask the student, I'd say, so what's tall to you? And let's say she says 6 foot or taller. Okay. About 80 of the 100 men would put their hands down, right? Because in the United States, only 20% of men are 6 foot or taller. Okay. So now you have only 20 people left out of your initial 100. Now let's say I want somebody who matches my political affiliation. That kind of conveniently breaks down into thirds. So about a third Republican, third Democrat, third independent. So, it's biased a bit in a college classroom. So you would have more liberals, right, than usual. But for thought experiment, let's say this is a general population, you would go down from 20 to about 5. So now you wish for two things. You wish for somebody who matches your political affiliation. You wish for someone who is 6 foot or taller. Now, whatever your third wish is, it could be anything. You're going to end up with one partner or a fraction of a partner. And we did this thought experiment dozens of times in this class across multiple years. And it's always the case that after 3 or 4 wishes, you go from having 100 possible people that you could date to having nobody. So I share that to say that every wish you make, right? Every wish you make has an opportunity cost or a trade-off. So by wishing for someone tall, for example, this woman lost 80% of her partner pool. And it just kind of keeps going like that. Someone takes a step back and they think about, what are the things I've traditionally been looking for or traditionally been prioritizing? oftentimes they can go through and see, wow, I've really narrowed to a very small part of the population just by not thinking hard about what it is that I want. But that's okay. I love it when people do that, because now here's this opportunity to say, okay, so these are the things that I have been wishing for or that I have been selecting on. If I really thought about it, and if I took my list of characteristics I want and rank ordered that carefully and with critical thought from 1 to 10, how different would that list look? And almost inevitably what I find is that people who have been struggling in relationships find a huge disconnect between the kind of man or woman that they've been selecting and the kind of man or woman that they actually want if they put their head to it.
It's such a fascinating experiment.
It's a winner. I mean, anytime you do this with a crowd, you can hear the gasp happen when the first round of hands go down. And then by the third wish, when there's nobody left or one person left, I mean, it is stunning. But if we go back to the online dating app example, that's exactly what you're doing when you're swiping on people. You're swiping.
Eliminating everything. Yeah.
Yes. Based on these criteria, or even before that, when you set limits on who you can even see in the first place, people think they're setting preferences, but once again, it's not preferences. These are hard rule outs. So if you want, I was giving one of my friends a hard time the other day. She lives over in the East Village with me, and she had set her radius to 0.5 miles for people that she would be able to see at all, even show up in her app. I was giving her a hard time, but that's a good example. And she just wants somebody close by for convenience, but had ruled out inadvertently hundreds of thousands or millions of men by this one criteria. And it's just because she didn't give them much thought.
From your perspective, let's just say people listening who kind of know better that maybe I've been putting too much focus on beauty or money, but they still do it. What is the itch that someone's trying to scratch there with those things?
I mean, I don't judge people for doing that. I mean, I can find myself susceptible to these same urges or mistakes if it is a mistake. It's just really hardwired. I mean, it's kind of coming from that hindbrain part of our brain, that more primal kind of urge part. It's the same thing that's making you eat the chocolate instead of your kale or whatever else. We have these urges that are reflexive and instantly rewarding if we engage in the behavior. And it's really tempting. And if we're just going on our intuition, we'll choose the thing that's easy and has immediate reward. So it's just part of this broader way that our brain works. What happened through the course, what we think happened through the course of evolution is that life expectancy now, right, is almost 80 years old. It's around 76 to 78 years old. It's easy to forget that just 150 years ago, life expectancy was like in the 50s, sometimes 60s if you were lucky to live in such a country. And if you go back not that much further in human history, life expectancy was in the 40s. So people were living in really threatening environments where their chances of dying or their offspring dying were actually exponentially higher than they are now. So what happens with that? What happens with that evolutionary pressure? Well, if the goal is to pass on your genes, right? So to have those kids reach a reproductive age, and then have their kids reach a reproductive age, and so on and so forth, then you would want to mate with somebody who has the genes to give you the best chance of survival, and not your chance, but really your kid's chance of survival. The thought is that physical attractiveness is an outward indicator of genetic health in high threat environments where there's a lot of disease and not a lot of medical technology. So during like hunter-gatherer times, for example, if you had a guy with that sharp jaw and the cheekbones and the broad shoulders and the V-shaped body, This was thought to be an indicator that of high testosterone release during adolescence. And this is actually pretty interesting. I think this is kind of nerdy, but if you had high hormone release, high testosterone release during adolescence, it made you more susceptible to viruses and other kinds of infections. So if you made it through that, despite your high hormone release, it would indicate that you have robust genes, right? Or that you would be someone robust to mate with. So that's the thought about physical attractiveness, is that facial symmetry and some of these other facial features that we tend to like in somebody, this is a vestigial trait from long ago where we just like people with a symmetrical face because we think they don't have genetic mutations that would be dangerous. Same thing for resources. If you were living in an environment where it was hard to get enough calories to survive on a day-to-day basis, yeah, you'd prioritize the person who has the biggest basket of berries or is the best at killing the water buffalo or whatever else it is that you need to eat. You would go for the person with the most resources. So we can beat up on ourselves sometimes for saying, hey, why am I so shallow? Why am I going for looks? Or why am I going for this money or these resources? It's actually pretty hardwired in you at some kind of fundamental level to be attracted to these things. But fortunately, our brains are pretty evolved. And so you're able, if you can recognize those impulses and say, hey, let's just stop for a second here and think about what I want to do with these impulses, then it's okay, and people can manage it a lot better. I think the problem is we just kind of run on autopilot a lot of times, and that's how we end up with partners who don't have the characteristics that we really want.
Yeah, I mean, in reading your book, there's so much that has changed over the past couple hundred years when it comes to the dating landscape. One of the most fascinating things that has changed is you cited research showing that just 2.5% of people said they would marry someone they weren't in love with. And then you contrasted that to other countries in the world where that number was up to like 50%. And so one of these large changes that has happened from a society that had a much shorter lifespan is this rise of like wanting to marry people that you're passionately in love with. And so what's your perspective on that shift? Like how much importance that we put on passionate love as a foundation of a relationship and whether that's hurting or helping us in the long term?
It is interesting that we think being in love with somebody is the number one criteria for marrying them. And it's actually weird when you look cross-culturally and you look across time. So I love that study that you referenced. That was across 11 countries, about 1,000 participants. And they said, would you marry somebody if you were not in love with him or her? What a great question. And in the United States, it was about 2.5% of people said that they would marry somebody if they were not in love with that person, which is really low. So we expect to be in love with somebody to marry them. It's probably the most important thing, actually. But if you looked at India and Pakistan, for example, about half of the respondents said that they would marry somebody who they weren't in love with when they married them. And I find that really fascinating. And we can be judgy about that living in the United States, but if you look at how satisfied and stable their marriages are, they do just as well as we do, even a little better by some metrics. So love, marriage and lifelong partnership historically can come about in many ways. Marriage as an institution is about 5,000 years old. And the early days of marriage, it was kind of thought if you're living in a hunter-gatherer group of, let's say, 40 or 50 people, and it comes time to start dating or mating with people, a really good way to have disharmony in the group is to have conflicts because people are fighting for mates, right? And so part of the early thought was, hey, if we have this institution of marriage, it now decreases the amount of potential for conflict because now two people are committed to each other and they're kind of off limits to the rest of the people in the group. And that kind of makes sense. It stayed that way for thousands of years. So for thousands of years, marriage was primarily a economic arrangement between families. And so you would get a couple cows maybe in exchange for your daughter, to be married to another family. And it was just seen as this way to exchange resources and also to keep things stable in society. Now, of course, things are dramatically different now. And that shift happened not that long ago, only about 160 years ago. And it was during the Romantic era. So if you think about Romantic music or Romantic literature, the ethos at that time, the mindset at that time was very different than the Classical era, which is, let's be ordered, let's have things be pretty predictable, and let's have things just be pleasing. Let's not rock the boat here. The Romantic era saw this rise of a moral imperative that I think is really interesting. And the moral imperative was this: if you're not passionately living your life, if you're not living at the edges of your emotional experience, you're not making the most of your life and you're squandering it. And that's actually immoral, which is pretty wild. It's a really interesting thought experiment. And if you're thinking about coming from an era where things were actually pretty buttoned up and maybe even a little boring, it's pretty exciting. Might have been like punk music in the 1970s, like let's mix this up. Let's make things really intense, and let's live at the edge of our capacity to love, our capacity to feel passion, our capacity to even feel things like anger or sadness. It was such an exciting time. And what happened as part of that larger cultural belief was people started to see romantic relationships and see marriage under that same kind of moral umbrella. So now, instead of marrying somebody for 3 or 4 cows, right, that would be exchanged between families, or just marrying somebody because it seems sensible as a union of your 2 families, not making your parents mad, now it became this individualistic, how do I maximize my passion? How do I maximize my passionate love in a union with somebody else? And that was a wild departure from everything else that had happened during the, 4,850 years of marriage up to that point. And it stays with us till today. And we have this idea that we should be in passionate love with somebody. So not just in love with somebody, we should be in passionate love with somebody. Butterflies in the stomach, heart-pounding kind of love. We've extended it further in modern society. So now we think, that passionate love should also last for decades on end. We also think that our romantic partner should be our financial partner. Our romantic partner should be our best friend. They should be kind of our co-CEO of raising our children and all these other things. Now, is that the reality of what modern partnership is? Yeah, a lot of times it is. Is that different than the way it used to be? Yes. There's never been more pressure on partners to fulfill so many roles as the primary person as there is now. And if you ask, a lot of couples to take a step back and be honest about, I'll say it's a lot. That is a lot of pressure. Sometimes people ask me, so why can't you have the butterflies in the stomach and the pounding heart? Why can't that last for forever? And I always tell them it's because you would die. So that pounding heart, that's high blood pressure if it stays sustained. If those butterflies in the stomach are leaving a trail of hormones that would eat an ulcer in your stomach, people shouldn't be afraid to fall in passionate love. That pounding heart and those butterflies are awesome. And you should enjoy that for as long as you can. But if you stayed in that level of physiological arousal for decades, that would probably be pretty tough on your body. And you have other things to do. You need to go to work and you need to think about other things, right? It's not to say that passionate love won't revisit you many times during the course of a decades-long marriage. It's just that we can't expect that's going to stay that way all the time. And when couples do expect that kind of high activation emotion, that passion to sustain all the time, they're sorely disappointed. And it leads to a lot of marital dissatisfaction and some risk for marital instability.
So Would you be an advocate for marrying somebody you weren't in love with in the 21st century?
I guess it depends on your cultural background. For me, for example, I was raised in the United States. I was raised in the majority view, I guess, that you should marry for love. Mm-hmm. So if I were to take myself as an example, I should probably marry for love. It's just part of my belief system and how I see things. Now, if it was somebody from another culture, though, who had been raised with this idea that, hey, you'll maybe get arranged to be married with somebody, and you'll grow to know that person, and you'll be flexible and try to evolve, each of you, to find a way to live harmoniously so that you can have a happy home and raise happy, functional, children. I fully support that as well. And the data says people can be very successful doing that if that's their worldview. So, I don't want to be culturally narrow about looking at it, but for most folks in the United States who were raised in the United States or another Western culture, you'll probably want to marry for love, which means essentially that you have some sort of intense attraction for the person and you like the person. But sometimes we forget that second part, that being in love with somebody is, it's passion and it's attraction, but more fundamentally in the long run, it's do I like this person? Can I hang out with this person? And one of the areas of research I love the most are these studies of couples who do find a happily ever after. This is the kind of reverse engineering that I love to do with romantic relationships. So these couples have been married 40, 50 years, and they've been happy more often than not. How'd they do it? It's kind of an interesting question. And what you find with those couples is if you look at the different kinds of love, so there can be passionate love, there can be, sexual driven kind of love, all these different forms. What drives the happiest couples is companionate love. It's this love that I just really love spending time with my partner. I think my partner is a cool person, and we're actually great friends, if not best friends. That's what sustains these couples across decades, and actually then serves as a foundation then to support the other kinds of love.
So I guess, is passionate love, do we just have wrong expectations around how much that is going to fuel a relationship? It's almost like we're going to enter into the relationship off this just amazing conditions, and we're going to fall in love, and then that's just going to sustain us. And then it's almost kind of like this passive, we fell out of love, and we're just not we're just not passionate about each other anymore, and so maybe the relationship should end. I mean,
that's what some people do. So most divorces actually happen in the United States. Not because couples were yelling and screaming at each other. It's because they say they lost the spark. That's actually the most common explanation. Now, the way I hear that is they're saying we lost the passion that we had at the very beginning. But I kind of like to reframe that a bit. So I view the passionate love you have those first, let's say, 2 or 3 years, almost as like rocket boosters on the space shuttle. So you are just burning hot and heavy during those first 2 or 3 years. And when you think about how insane it is to say, I'm going to spend 50 or 60 years with you, maybe you need those rocket boosters on your relationship to launch you into that kind of commitment. And boy, is it fun and great and passionate. Now those rocket boosters fade away, let's say 2 or 3 years in. Does that mean the mission is over? Does it mean that this isn't worthwhile anymore? And I would say no. I say this is actually when it gets pretty interesting, right? That was one phase, and now we're in this other phase, which is the longer and more meaningful and substantive phase. But if we have this erroneous expectation passed down to us from our culture that you're supposed to have the rocket boosters, for the entire trip, that's really unhelpful. That's really unhelpful. So once again, nothing wrong with having passionate love. And I love it when people are in passionate love. I say, fully immerse yourself in it and just love it, because what else in life feels that good? I can't really think of maybe anything or very few things. So people should enjoy it, but also it has a function. And there's a longer path to this. And so let's not think, what do I want? Who do I want to marry? Let's think, who do I want to be married to? And what do I want that to be like 20 years from now? I think that's the better question to ask. Now that, even without all the stuff that you and I have talked about so far, a reasonable person now will dramatically adjust their expectations based on that question. But if you ask them, what do you want out of your romantic life? They say, I want a happily ever after. Well, that's actually, what do you want with a romantic partner 20, 30 years down the road? So it maps better onto what people actually want.
You said that being in love is like having to pee.
Yes, it is urgent and all-consuming. I love, there have been some fMRI studies of people in passionate love, so they're not, first 2 or 3 years, where they're just ridiculous. And if you put them in these, so fMRIs are taking pictures of your brain, but it's like video instead of a photo. So it's watching your brain in motion. And so you can get a baseline, they're just laying there. And then you have them think about the romantic partner. Just think about the romantic partner. And all of a sudden, you see this flood of changes happen in their brains, and the reward centers light up like crazy. The areas of the brain associated with negative emotions actually deactivate. So they're not just inactive, it's actually harder to get an activation in those areas. So any parent who struggled with a teenager who's blindly and blissfully in love with somebody, and this somebody is not a great partner who has tons of costs, their teenage brain is operating on pure benefit analysis and no cost analysis. It's actually very hard for them to do. And this can even happen to adults, right? And so if you take a brain that looks like that, that's a brain that's all consumed on reward and on pleasure, and is focused on this one person and being in a relationship with that person. And, having to pee doesn't feel great. But feeling urgent in a way that's so positive and like loving and passionate, I think that's pretty exciting.
Yeah. So, at one level, I think you need the science, you need the data, you need the rational brain to kind of help guide this situation. At another level, it's kind of, like you said, completely irrational. I think anybody who's ever had that experience of feeling in love, especially if it was like euphoric, it's like, it's not like, it's like, oh, I'm not doing cocaine or heroin, I'm not doing an actual drug. It's like seemingly this good thing that we're just all over each other, completely transfixed. But it really struck me when you said the one part of the brain just like shuts down. It's kind of like we then put our blinders on and then just become transfixed on this person.
That's right. And you have this, what researchers call positive sentiment override, which is a horrible jargony term, and it just means you're whipped, right? And so you are so glowing and just head over heels about this person. You just cannot rationally think about this person or about this relationship. You're just all about the good times. And that happens to the best of us. And that's kind of how I got into this in the first place, is when you looked at how irrational all of us are when we're in passionate love. That's not the time to reason with people, really, right? And what it made me think is the time to reason with people is right after a breakup, actually. Right after they've had their heart broken or a relationship didn't work out the way they thought it was going to work out. Now you all of a sudden have this clarity wash over you all of a sudden. And now you can actually take a step back and more rationally and fairly evaluate, hey, who was this person I was dating? And what were the pros and cons? What were the pros and cons in our relationship? And also importantly, what were my liabilities and mistakes in the relationship, and also my strengths, and how could I do better going forward? So what I like to tell folks is when you got a moment, and a lot of times that's between relationships, this is the time to get your list in order. What are the traits that are most important to you? What is it that you actually really value? What is it that you want in your relationship 20 or 30 years from now? Get all of these logical, reasonable things set in place when you're in a logical headspace. Now, when you meet somebody and you're in passionate love, now you can just enjoy it, right? You don't have to be trying to do this head-heart balance, which is really hard to do, and not overthink it and ruin the emotions that you're feeling. So, yeah. There's a time and place for everything. And then if you are in passionate love and there is some deal breaker with this partner, something toxic that you need to watch out for, now you have a shot at identifying that they have this characteristic because you identified it ahead of time.
The moral aspect of this is interesting because you explained that a little bit earlier about how there's a moral imperative to pursue this desire. Now, I don't know if that's because I've been conditioned that way, but then another question comes up for me is this must have been a thing throughout all of human history at some level. I can't imagine that in the year 1800, somebody a man wasn't grabbing a woman passionately and wanting to have sex with her and being infatuated. So if people were kind of marrying others in this kind of very systematic, rudimentary way, what was happening with those sort of passionate exchanges with people?
Yeah.
Did they exist? How did that manifest in society? Yeah.
A lot of suppressed desire throughout human history. Once again, if you take a look at some of the anthropological work on romantic relationships, it's fascinating and runs counter to some of certainly my intuitive hypotheses, and probably for many of us, what we think was the case. And, I think sometimes we think that back in the day, people didn't cheat as much, or there wasn't as much out of wedlock stuff that happened. And it happened actually quite a bit. People just didn't talk about it as much, or they swept it under the rug. There was a lot of unfulfilled desire that people had. And so even if you were in an arranged marriage, or you were in a marriage because of a financial arrangement of some kind, it didn't mean that you didn't maybe have desire for Jim or Sally, two blocks down the road. You still had that, but the societal constraints were so rigid and so punishing if you stepped out of line that people largely conformed to what was expected of them.
Oh, I mean, in some sense, I'd imagine somebody's listening and being like, well, the scenario that you have today is a better one.
Yeah.
What would you say?
I would say so. I mean, I'm kind of a fan of, let's just give people a choice and let them use their own best judgment and be adults about things. I'm generally in favor of that. I also think that sometimes we don't use our freedom in the wisest ways possible. And that's one of the stages as a society that we're in right now. We've never had more choice. We've never had more kind of freedom to decide who we partner with. And this whole experiment that's been going on the past 160 years of marrying for passion and marrying for romantic love is at a tough juncture right now. Now, there's a lot of reasons why that could be the case. Let me give you one that might apply to the last 10 or 20 years. If you're going to predict how committed somebody is in a relationship, or if they will commit to a relationship, there's an algorithm for that. And what's interesting to me about this is it's the same algorithm they'll use over at the business school or the econ department to predict things like when people will buy and sell stocks, or when people will buy or sell a house, for example. And the equation is essentially this. What do you want from something, from an investment, right? What do you perceive that you're getting? And then importantly, and this is the one people oftentimes miss, what are your attractive alternative options? So is there something else? Is there another investment that would give you something closer to what you actually want, right? And so if you think about that for a stock, for example, you can easily think about how that math would work. Well, it turns out the same thing happens when we think about remaining committed to a partner or committing to a romantic relationship. What do we want from somebody? What do we perceive that we're getting? And really important, what are our perceived attractive alternative options? Do we think the grass is greener somewhere else? And what's changed with online dating, and I don't think anybody meant to do this, it's just an unintended consequence, is that attractive alternative option part of the equation has gone wild, right? It used to be the case, let's say 100 years ago, and you went to a school of maybe 100 students, you're like, I got 50 options. Here, that's your perceived number of options available. Now it's the case, you live someplace like New York City, you think you have infinite options. You have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of options available in your pocket on your phone. Now, that totally changes the psychology of whether or not people will commit to somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. That is universally such a change, not just with dating, but the presence of options, what I should be doing with my life, how many things I can order on Amazon, the 9,000 TV shows and movies on Netflix and Apple TV and everything else. And so we're like inundated with so much choice.
That's so true. I could not agree more with you about the inundation with so many choices to a point that it's overwhelming. And so, there's this tyranny of freedom or tyranny of choice from social psychology, which could not be more appropriate for our current times.
Yeah.
Where even buying like soap feels so overwhelming. You have just so many choices that it can lead to paralysis. And, if we loop back to thinking about why is it so hard for young adults to date right now, part of it could be also, another factor could be this tyranny of choice or this tyranny of freedom, where they're so overwhelmed by the number of choices available, it's just kind of hard to even make any decisive steps.
Yeah. So we talked about beauty, money, being love, some of the large societal shifts in terms of the number of options. One more thing I wanted to address was the other big societal shift. Obviously, a lot of progress with this and a lot of positives, like the desire for a more equitable type of arrangement between a man and a woman versus kind of previous type power dynamics that were happening in relationships. And so I wonder if the flip side of that has been a hesitance to study or even examine how maybe even gender dynamics might influence the impact of a long-term relationship, and if there's any truth in a harmony that would potentially arise and what that would be. Have you come across any research around this subject of it and how that impacts the long-term viability of a relationship, at least in straight relationships?
Gender roles are really fascinating, and I might get myself in trouble here talking about some of this data, but I do think it is important to talk about, though, in a transparent kind of way.
Yeah.
My personal value set is I think it's good to have a more equitable set of responsibilities between men and women. That's kind of where I come from. Now, do I think that has been easy? Not at all, And of course, gender roles and what's expected traditionally of a man, what's traditionally expected of a woman, those things have been entrenched for a very long time. Now we have this thing over the past, 30, 40 years, let's say, give or take, where it's like, hey, we should have an equitable arrangement where the woman has just as much freedom in her career or her education, for example, as the man does. But what's happened for the average couple is they've really struggled to figure out how to manage that. And one of the things that is a real bummer for straight women right now who do have that kind of more equitable view of relationships is even if they're married to a man who also holds this equitable view of responsibilities, this kind of more progressive view of gender roles, he still does not do his fair share of work around the house. And so now it's kind of worse in some ways at this. I'm not saying we should give up on it, but I'm saying it's extra challenging because now a couple has gone into the marriage saying, hey, we're going to share everything equally and we're going to approach this in an equitable manner. And now the woman's doing the dishes 6 days out of the week. If I was a woman, I'd be pretty ticked off about that. And, you can keep going on and on. If you look at the hours worked for women when it comes to childcare and household work, it exhausts you as a man just looking at the amount of labor that they're putting in addition to now, right, being full-time at work as well. And one of my favorite studies that just came out last year on this, of course it was done by women, was that men not only don't do their share of household work, they actually generate 7 to 8 hours of housework for the woman to do because they have their nasty socks on the ground or they haven't done the dishes for however many days or whatever else. So yeah, I believe in this vision of let's have both people have the same amount of freedom and the same amount of responsibility that they can take on. But if we're being honest about it, are there challenges that couples encounter, your average couple? Yes, there are. And if I were doing couples therapy with somebody, this is a case where I get on the man pretty hard. I'm like, look, buddy, you're saying theoretically that you believe X, Y, and Z, but you're not pulling your weight. And so, it's totally understandable that your wife is pissed off at you about these things, and she totally has a right to be.
Yeah.
So either don't say it and then find out some other way to make this equitable, or I think the easier thing is just start pulling your weight. And anecdotally, I'm actually I'm surprised by if you just lay it out for the guy, and me as a third party, I'm stern about it. And then they're a reasonable person. They see their wife's not only upset, but it kind of hurts her feelings too, that he doesn't care enough to do these things. Over time, you can see positive changes in this way. So,
I mean, I was kind of sprung on to being interested in this topic. I mean, we had a sex therapist on here, and it was really interesting to me because he was talking about that there's a large percentage of women who come into his office and complain because they want their man to be more assertive in the bedroom. And that kind of corroborated to other things I was hearing female sex therapists hear of other women in their office as well. And it just kind of made me think like there was something wrong about the way dynamics were in the past. I mean, there were obvious things, and the value and worth of a human being and that being equal for men and women seemed like something that needed to be corrected, and women having equal pay and some of these things. But then it also made me think like, are there things that come naturally to a man in a relationship or a woman that shouldn't be thrown over as like an oppressive dynamic, or you should be boxed in because of that? But there are certain things that would make a relationship more harmonious or happy if people played into those roles. And it seemed from what sex therapists have been saying is that not all women, not 100% women, but a lot of women wanted like an assertive man in the bedroom, which means in some level she wants something that is like more conventional to be happening. And so I just wonder if there's like a more nuanced way to have this conversation that isn't so binary of like all or nothing type of mentality. But
I mean, I really appreciate you bringing that up because it's a tricky thing to talk about.
Yeah.
And I would agree with the other folks you've had on who have said something that I'll hear too is that some women want a more assertive man in the bedroom. And there's a couple of ways to approach that. One of the ways I kind of like to, I guess the entry point I like to have is let's make it okay to have gender stereotypical roles if that's what you want.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, hey, I'm gonna stereotypically have a male gender role, just have this openness in the couple where it's like, hey, if someone wants to be more assertive in the bedroom and it's the man, that's cool. And that's totally okay. But once again, people have to talk about this. You know, they have to talk about what they want and what was pleasurable to them and the kinds of things that turn them off. And that's a really tricky conversation to have, of course. But I think everyone's on edge these days about so many things. And I understand that. But if you're in this intimate relationship with somebody, you know, you need that foundation where you can have those open conversations about something as tricky as sex and what your preferences are. And it's unbelievable in sex therapy what happens from conversation. You know? And the guy's just like, I had no idea you like that. You wanted that. And there's two questions there. It's like, one, I would put on the guy first. I'd say, why didn't you ask? And then two, you could also say, hey, for the female partner, it's okay to express what you want, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So I think but that goes back to the stereotype we have, which is really unhelpful. We kind of call them romantic ideals, which is, and part of the romantic ideal is like, you should be able to read my mind.
Yeah.
So one of the main things in these idealized scales they have, or these romanticized ideal measures that they have, is mind reading. And people, one of the phrases you'll often hear is, if you don't know what's wrong, I'm not going to tell you.
Yeah.
And that is such a silly, such a silly thing to say in some ways. But it goes to this unhelpful stereotype we have that, we should be able to mind read. And actually it's no, you just got to talk about it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think you have these kind of harmful stereotypes of the past of like, oh, well, men can only do this or women can only do this. But now you kind of have this other polar opposite stereotype of like, well, every single thing in the relationship needs to be 50-50 for 100% of couples and 100% of situations. And the two people in the relationship may not actually want that for themselves. And so I think it opens up a dialogue for like a new conversation. So
absolutely. I couldn't agree more, you know, and I mean, I kind of have this more equitable, view of things. That's kind of what I lean towards, certainly. Yeah. But hey, if I meet a couple and it's trad wife and kind of typical guy sort of thing with kind of typical gender role, and they couldn't be happier with each other. I mean, good for them.
Yes.
That works. On the other hand, if, you want to blow the doors off the gender roles and have some, non-traditional kind of relationship, but you treat each other well and you're happy, and good for you too.
So if we've talked about a lot of things, but if you were to like build a relationship from scratch, what are the sorts of mind shifts that people should be having? Like, what should we be chasing instead and building the foundation on?
Yeah, if I were to build the ideal relationship, I would start by not looking at the relationship, which is what most people do. I would start by looking at what's the ideal partner rather than what's the ideal relationship. The reason I say that is the relationship's going to evolve and it's going to change over time. And that could be for better or it could be for worse. Regardless, there will be turbulence in that as the relationship changes and as each individual changes a little bit. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of a moving target. Saying this is you want to have an idea of the relationship you want, but what you know at the start is this is the person I'm sitting with right now, and what are they like? And I encourage people to put their focus on that. So we know from our earlier conversation, most people will spend 2 of their top 3 wishes on looks and money. We know the return on investment from looks and money is not great. It's about 0 for looks, and it's a diminishing return once you get past the poverty line for income.
Is passionate love the third one? Or is that not?
Women will say kindness. So women will toss kindness up there. And then, men will say something, they're all over the place, men, But it's usually a decent characteristic for the third one. But they're spending 2 of their top 3 wishes on traits that don't have a great return for happiness or stability. So then the question becomes, so what should you wish for in your ideal romantic partner? And I don't want to prescribe what anybody should absolutely do, but also it's the case that research gives us some great insights into some traits that are really valuable, that do have a large return on investment for your relationship happiness and for your relationship stability. Mm-hmm. So let's take a personality configuration that's pretty popular, which is the big 5 personality traits. It's extroversion, extroversion, introversion, how talkative, how shy are you? Openness to experience, kind of how adventure-seeking are you versus, kind of passive or conservative. How agreeable are you? How kind and nice are you versus how antagonistic and mean are you? Conscientiousness, which is how much do you have your act together, basically, versus how much of a disaster are you? Mm-hmm. And then there's emotional stability. So how even are you in your emotions versus how moody and angry are you? Across those 5 factors, there's now been dozens of studies with hundreds of thousands of people. And they've asked the question, can you predict from those 5 personality traits in each partner how happy people will be 10 years, 20 years from now? And also what their divorce risk is 10, 20 years from now? Yeah, the answer is yes, you can. And so even before the couple has met each other in some of these studies, when they have this clean shot of what their personality traits are, it turns out that emotional stability is a really powerful predictor of both marital satisfaction and marital stability, not only in the present moment, but also looking ahead, predicting 10 years down the road and 20 years down the road. So if there was a personality trait that would be my number 1 draft choice when choosing a partner, it would be emotional stability. And what a dull sounding thing to choose on. But let's think about that for a moment. You're getting somebody who's not moody, not angry, not pessimistic. So you're not dealing with all of the negatives that come along with that. On the other hand, you're getting somebody who's optimistic. You're getting someone who, when tough times come, which will inevitably come in a relationship, they handle it with a certain amount of just grace, right? And calm.
Yeah.
How nice is that? And it's predictive of satisfaction, stability. It's a moderate to large effect. There's 2 other traits that I find really interesting that are predictive. So agreeableness is predictive. So I think having a kind, generous partner is one of the most underrated qualities in our culture.
Is that similar to passiveness, or no, is that different?
If it's in an extreme version, so let's say if someone's extremely, extremely agreeable, like top 1 percentile, then yeah, they're kind of a pushover.
Yeah.
And kind of maybe uninteresting in that way. But if they're just like, have a solid amount of agreeableness, another way to say that is this person has a really cooperative spirit.
Yeah.
They're very empathic and they want to get along. That's how they're oriented towards the world. And of course, that's predictive of marital satisfaction, also predictive of marital stability. And as we discussed before, it's predictive of sexual satisfaction as well. The last trait, which is maybe my favorite one, is people who are low in conscientiousness and kind of high in adventurousness or openness. So these are people who are high in impulsivity or sensation seeking. And the thing about people who are high in sensation seeking is that they are the most fun to date. So if you're dating someone who likes new experiences, who's always, wanting to mix it up, they'll take you on super fun dates. They'll be really spontaneous. They're high in what we call absorption, which means they really get almost hypnotically immersed in experiences. And so they'll be really absorbed in you and the relationship. And that feels great, of course. So here you have this exciting person picking you up on a motorcycle. They're all about you, telling you, they're love bombing you left and right. But, people who are high in sensation seeking, they're also very impulsive. And so they're at risk for substance abuse, gambling addictions, infidelity, all these kind of impulsive behaviors. They're also more likely to get bored more quickly, which means they'll get bored with you more quickly. And so this is a really interesting trait, I think, because here's something that on the front end, when it first presents to you, looks like the best thing ever, right? But if you project ahead to how this plays out, if the person is really high in sensation seeking, the way that's going to play out is going to introduce a lot of risk into your relationship. And next thing you know, you're in a fetal position in the corner crying, because they've cheated on you or done something else that was maybe callous or even ruthless, because all they're doing is they're following their impulses, not necessarily thinking about the consequences of those impulses on other people.
Yeah. I think pointing out those personality traits is so fascinating. And I kind of want to revisit what you're talking about, the 3 wishes, because there's kind of this thought that you can have it all. And kind of through that exercise, that every kind of, because people have these wish lists that when they approach their relationships and they want all these different things in a partner, and they think certain things are so important. But when you really understand that every wish, now you're narrowing the population. Can you reframe that and talk about that a little bit more in terms of how we're kind of limiting our base?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one way people could take what I'm saying is they could interpret it as I'm saying you should settle. And that is, I do not want people to think that. Please do not settle. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is, hey, let's just use our heads, right? Because you're a smart person, and let's prioritize. So let's get the things that you want, but to be sure that we get the things that are the most important to you, let's prioritize. And of course, that's what you would do in any other aspect of life. If your financial life or your nutrition or anything else, you would prioritize the things that are most important to make sure those things happen first. So let's go through a thought experiment. If someone says to me, I want to live happily ever after with somebody, I'm like, so that means that you want to 30 years from now be with somebody and you want to be mostly happy in that relationship and you want to have the confidence that they'll be committed and it's going to last. Yes, exactly. And then I say, behind door number 1, I have someone who's hot and wealthy and has a college degree. Behind door number 2, I have someone who's kind and generous and thoughtful and emotionally stable. They're fun, but they're not impulsive. They have a level of commitment and put togetherness that's going to make it very easy for them to do the things in a relationship that need to be done on a daily basis to make it gratifying. Do you want, which of those 2 partners do you want? If your goal is to be with someone 30 years from now and be happy. And of course, it's an easy decision, right? And if you ask couples who have been married for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, what have been the things that have been the most important for you having a happy, enduring relationship? They love to say, oh, he was so handsome when I first met him, or she was so pretty, or whatever. I've never heard, and I talk to a lot of people about their relationships. I've never heard anybody decades down the road say that it was looks or money that mattered. It's always, they have a generous heart that you can't imagine. It's always, they have been so curious about my life and supportive about my goals in life that I've known they've always loved me. Those are the kinds of things that really matter. And so when I tell people, hey, don't settle, prioritize, that's what I'm talking about. I'm saying get the things that are actually really important to you to get the kind of relationship that you want. And yes, get somebody who has a level of financial stability that you want. Yes, get somebody who you're attracted to. But let's not make those things the 2 things that you lead with.
Yeah.
Right? One of my favorite stories I heard was from an older couple. They'd been married over 50 years. And it was the husband I was talking to, and because sadly his wife had passed a couple years ago. They'd been the happily ever after, really. And we were having a great conversation. And so I asked him, I said, so what, I'm sorry for your loss. What is it that you miss the most about your wife? And he said, I miss that she knew I took 2 lumps of sugar in my coffee. I thought that was the coolest, most heartwarming thing. And because, of course, what he was telling me is I was important to her. Being cooperative and being a team was important to her. And we shared that for one another, and we sacrificed for one another. And we wanted the best for one another. That's what really mattered.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I think we almost look at it like it's a virtuous, like you said before, moral thing. We tend to lead with, oh, I was in passionate love with him. I think they're really attractive. And it's almost like if you explain the reason that you married someone for these other reasons, emotional stability, agreeableness, it's like we don't look at it in that same like shiny light. But those are the things that actually will produce the outcome that you want. And I love the framing of it that you're putting it too, because it's like, it's nuanced. You're not saying, hey, live in poverty and be wildly unattracted to your spouse. But the level of importance that we place on those things is going to make a big difference.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm sure one of the sex therapists you've talked to has said that one of the things that's really hot to women is when the guy does the dishes. So there's these things that happen over the course of the long run of a relationship. And it's hard to imagine when you're in like your mid-20s or your late 20s, like doing the dishes is going to be really sexy at some point. Or some of these other things that are kind of mundane, like 2 lumps of sugar in the coffee is going to be really important. But, I would encourage people who are single and maybe even younger, do some investigation. Ask around to couples that you admire. Like, what are the things that have really made a difference in your relationship? And, how'd that compare to some of the things that you experienced early on in a relationship or that you thought would be important that really weren't? And one thing I should say about the gentleman, about the 2 lumps of sugar in the coffee guy, I mean, he was a handsome guy and she was an attractive woman, and they were in passionate love with each other. So they had all the things too. Yeah. It's just that he was wise enough and she was wise enough very early on to say, hey, if this is going to be a thing, if this is actually going to be a thing, these other more important qualities have to be in place. And it's nice that, I mean, it was this really idyllic story in some ways, kind of a Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift story. He was the starting quarterback and she was the head cheerleader thing. But they were both wise enough to know that those were definitely not the most important characteristics.
If people were to take the inverse of that, I mean, people are very concerned about like red flags today and stuff like that. And much has been made over the past 40 years of John Gottman's research. Divorce can be predicted with 94% accuracy. From his work in the Four Horsemen, from what you've looked in the synthesizing of all this data, what are the main predictors of divorce that you can immediately look at? Like, okay, that is not going to end up well.
Right. Well, I mean, the Gottmans have done amazing work, of course, across a number of decades. And for people who are unfamiliar with it, they can observe couples for 15 minutes in the lab, have self-report measures, also behavioral observation measures of watching the couple interact, and also physiological measures like heart rate or how much they're sweating, and predict with very high accuracy whether they'll be divorced 10 or 20 years later, which is incredible from a 15-minute clip. Now, one of the things they find that's predictive behaviorally is that couples that end up divorcing engage in a lot of what we call demand withdrawal patterns. And what that means is that somebody is demanding something from the other person, but in a way that's like angry and really edgy. So this isn't politely. It's they're ticked off about something. And so they're demanding, they're not asking. What the other partner does, and this evolves over time, is the other person withdraws. So not only are they just saying, no, not right now, honey, they're stonewalling is one of the words the Gottmans use. So they're actively blowing off the other person. So that's for example, the husband turning up the volume on the TV when the wife brings something up. You want to enrage somebody, that's a really great way to do it. What happens over time is the demand gets more intense and the withdrawal gets more pronounced.
Yeah.
And so now you have these people really far apart. Well, what somebody could do is they could say, well, if we were to go back to dating, would there have been traits and characteristics of each partner that would have predicted these virulent demand patterns and these, right, really withdrawing, kind of callous withdrawal patterns? And of course, you could. Is someone going to withdraw from an interaction that's important to the other person if they're high in agreeableness? Probably not, right? They want to engage, they want to be cooperative, so they're not going to blow you off. Is somebody going to get really angry and throw a beer bottle across the room and demand something if they're emotionally stable?
No.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Right? And oftentimes what happens with couples is they get into these bad places, and it's okay if a couple gets to a bad place. It happens sometimes even to the happiest of couples. But it can feel like you're so out of control, and it can feel like it's so hard to understand what's happening that, I have a lot of empathy for that when people talk to me about that. And so part of my job is oftentimes to say, one, look, we can work on this, but then number two, let's trace back where this came from. And so then you break down the behaviors, right? There's a demand withdrawal pattern. They're like, oh, yes, that happens all the time. Well, hey, demander person, when you get really angry, do you have a tendency to get angry? And oftentimes they'll say, yeah, it's been a lifelong thing for me. It's been something I've struggled with. Okay. And that's okay, right? But now we're talking about it. And now we have something manageable that we can deal with. For the person who's withdrawing, it's like, hey, do you just tend to shut down and avoid things? Yeah, I guess that's always kind of been a thing. All right. Well, let's work on it then. And one of the really, great things that happens in couples therapy is that couples gain an understanding, a digestible and manageable understanding of what's going on. Number two, they start to work on it. So they try to be better, right? But number three, and I think this is undervalued sometimes, is they gain an acceptance for the other person's weaknesses or the other person's mistakes. That doesn't mean it's okay. So for the guy who's leaving his nasty socks on the ground, he's not off the hook, right? But instead of the wife seeing it and being surprised every single time she sees it and getting equally enraged every time she sees it, it's like, what I'll say in that situation is I'll say, how many times have you come home and you saw his nasty socks on the ground over the past 100 days? And she'll say 100 times. And then in a kind of a playful way, I'll say, so, why are we surprised? And if you have a good rapport, they'll be like, good point.
Yeah.
Good point. You immediately then turn on the person who's committing the transgression. Say, look, it's not all right. We got to do better. But on the other end, let's have some patience for this, as long as the other person's committed to working on it and they're making progress.
Yeah. Well, we've covered so much ground today. I mean, I think a lot of these insights will be pretty revelatory for people in terms of having mind shifts on their priorities and the way that they're looking at certain traits and relationships. I kind of wanted to close by kind of speaking to the people that might be a little bit more cynical right now about this conversation. What does a happy, long-term, lasting relationship, what does that mean to the significance of someone's life? Fulfillment, meaning, all of that stuff.
If you're able to find a happily ever after, right? So you find a partner who you're you're happy with and is stable. There are a few things that are more meaningful to, your personal happiness and to having a meaningful life. It's just one of those things. I mean, you see this person almost every day, and they're an integral part of everything that you do. There's nothing you're more invested in the world than this person. And if you have kids with them, your kids, which you're collaboratively working on, right? Giving your all to raising these good human beings. And what an incredibly powerful experience that is. Now, I'll also say this. You don't want to force it. And so the worst situation, as far as being unhappy in life and being dissatisfied with how things are going, is to be in a relationship and have that relationship be unhappy or have really tenuous commitment. That's the worst possible outcome. So people who are single, but happy with their single life, they do pretty good. Mm-hmm. They do pretty good in the larger scheme of things. So if that's someone's lot in life, you're great. Yeah. You're doing good. But I would also say that if someone does want to have a lifelong commitment in a romantic relationship or to be married, and they're committed to working at it, to understanding the imperfections and the challenges that'll come, there are a few things more worthwhile to devote yourself to than that. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why I do this work. Is I had a advisor in graduate school, Ellen Burchide. She was actually one of the first people who ever applied the scientific method to the study of romantic love. And she would say, Ty, like, what other area of life do we feel such powerful negative emotions or ruminate about things in our minds or do bizarre things, behaviors, than our romantic relationships? And conversely, what other area of life do we do so many amazing things and behaviors and grow in our beliefs and attitudes about the world and feel such a deep and profound love for somebody and for an entity? Of course, it's hard to think, right, of something else. And so whether someone's single or someone's married, and they're both routes to having a very fulfilling life through both of those, right, avenues. But if you are one of the folks who wants to find a happily ever after, it's a worthwhile endeavor.
My last question is, so specifically thinking about the way we began, we were talking a little bit about Gen Z and not wanting to be in a relationship, disillusionment with dating apps, stuff like that. So for the person listening who feels burned, cynical, they'll find a happy, lasting relationship. What's one line you'd want to carry them to carry?
One of the things, and this is just anecdotal, but it's something I've probably been thinking about this more than anything else these days. When I looked at the songs that are most popular for Gen Z, and a lot, I'm kind of into pop music, so I looked at a lot of the pop songs. Ariana Grande, Charlie XCX, some of these, Chappell Roan. The theme that runs through a lot of these popular songs that are great songs is not only having desire and having that desire go unfulfilled, but also having like a tentativeness or a fear about even expressing that desire to the world.
Yeah.
And I can understand that. And I think that is a feeling that captures so well what a lot of 18 to 30-year-olds are feeling right now. Is I have these dreams, I have these things that I really want and these desires, and I just find it to be such an inhospitable world to express those things. And it makes me really bummed, that that's what they have, that's what's been given to them. I guess if I could say something, it would be, don't listen to what people from my generation or others are telling you to do as far as overthinking things. Or to get so involved down rabbit holes in social media that you're overwhelmed with the choices and the amount of information that you have. Your intuition is oftentimes right and can be trusted. And the desires and the dreams that you have, those are valid kinds of things inherently in and of themselves. Mm-hmm. And I guess the thing I wish for sometimes after I talk to college students is I just say, I just want you to go for what you want, and I want you to feel empowered to go after for what you want. Whether it's in your career or your friendships, or certainly in the context of what you and I are talking about, your romantic relationships. There has to be just this leap of faith to make the commitment to pursue the things that they want. Mm.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming in today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, really enjoyed the conversation.
I enjoyed it too. Thank you. Yeah.